Here are some facts about me. I am alone in the whole world. I had many conflicts with fellow scientists. They didn't understand me at all. I never forgave my mother. They say I have bipolar disorder. Maybe, but I don't have time for that. All facts are truth. I am Isaac Newton, an English mathematician and physicist, best known for formulating the laws of motion and universal gravitation, and for my contributions to calculus and optics. I am ashamed of some things, and some things almost destroyed me. However, it is an integral part of my life. It proves that famous people have the same problems and life challenges as everyone else. Now all about it in more detail. Section 1. I am alone in the whole world. Loneliness, it's not something I sought, but it became an inevitable part of my life. You see, my work demanded a kind of focus that left little room for anything else. Perhaps I could have made time for friends, for companionship, but the truth is, I didn't desire it as much as others seemed to. I was consumed by my studies, by the questions that kept me awake at night, the nature of light, the force that governs the heavens, the very fabric of reality itself. From my early years, I was different. I was born prematurely and grew up without my father, who had died before I was born. My mother remarried and left me in the care of my grandparents when I was just 3 years old. That abandonment shaped me. I learned to rely on myself, to retreat inward, and to find solace in my thoughts. Relationships didn't come naturally to me, not as a child and not as an adult. I never married. It wasn't that I dismissed the idea entirely, but I couldn't see how a partnership would fit into the life I had chosen, or rather, the life that chose me. My work in mathematics, physics, and alchemy consumed me. I often worked late into the night, driven by an insatiable curiosity and an equally insatiable fear of failure. People fascinated me less than ideas, and I found the company of books more predictable, more reliable. This isolation wasn't without consequence. While I made groundbreaking discoveries, formulating the laws of motion, understanding gravity, and advancing calculus, I did so largely alone. There were moments when I felt the sting of loneliness, especially as I grew older. Even among my colleagues at the Royal Society, where I eventually became president, I struggled to form deep connections. My reputation for being difficult, arrogant, even, didn't help. I demanded much of others, but no more than I demanded of myself. That high standard, however, kept most people at arm's length. One of the few close relationships I had was with Nicolas Fatio de Duillier, a Swiss mathematician. For a time, we shared a bond based on our mutual intellectual pursuits. Some have speculated about the nature of that relationship, but whatever it was, it didn't last. Like many connections in my life, it ended in misunderstanding and distance. My most enduring companionship, if it can be called that, was with my work. When I wasn't conducting experiments or writing treatises, I was deeply invested in alchemy and theology, fields that are less discussed when people speak of me today. Alchemy, in particular, occupied years of my life. I sought the philosopher's stone, the elixir of life, not because I wished for immortality but because I believed it could reveal the fundamental truths of the universe. That pursuit was solitary, secretive, and, in the eyes of many, eccentric. But for me, it was a calling. Even in my later years, when I was at the height of my fame, I remained apart. My role as warden and later master of the Royal Mint brought me into contact with many people, but these interactions were professional, not personal. I focused on reforming the currency, rooting out counterfeiters with the same determination I had once applied to solving mathematical equations. But at the end of the day, I went home alone. Perhaps the closest I came to emotional connection was with my niece, Catherine Barton, who kept house for me in my later years. She brought some warmth to my otherwise cold domestic life, hosting gatherings and bridging the gap between me and the outside world. But even then, I remained distant. I observed more than I participated, preferring to remain an enigma even to those closest to me. Do I regret this life of isolation? It's difficult to say. My solitude allowed me to achieve what I did, to uncover truths that had eluded humanity for centuries. But it came at a cost. There were times when I envied those who could form deep connections, who found joy in the simple company of others. Yet, I could never bring myself to prioritize those things. My mind was always elsewhere, on the orbit of the planets, the nature of light, the mysteries of God. I suppose the loneliness was both my burden and my strength. It gave me the space to think, to explore, to create. But it also left me without the comfort of companionship, without the warmth of close relationships that might have softened the harder edges of my life. Whether that was a fair trade, I leave for others to judge. For me, it was simply the life I lived. Section 2. Conflict with fellow scientists. Conflict, it was as much a part of my life as my work in mathematics and physics. My relationships with some of my contemporaries were marked by acrimony and distrust. Among them, my disputes with Robert Hooke and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz stand out as particularly bitter chapters. These conflicts, though they concerned intellectual matters, often became deeply personal and left scars on my reputation and the scientific community. Let me begin with Robert Hooke, a man of significant intellect but, in my view, also a man prone to overestimating his own contributions. Hooke and I were members of the Royal Society, and while we shared a commitment to scientific progress, we rarely saw eye to eye. Our most contentious disagreement revolved around the nature of light and optics. Hooke had published work on the subject, and when I presented my theory of light and colors, arguing that white light was composed of a spectrum of colors, he was one of my fiercest critics. He claimed my ideas were derivative of his own work, a claim I found baseless and infuriating. To me, his criticisms seemed more like attempts to assert his dominance in the field rather than engage in genuine scientific discourse. Our exchanges in letters and at society meetings became increasingly hostile, and my irritation with him only grew. Perhaps the most enduring symbol of our conflict was his claim that I owed my insights into the law of universal gravitation to his earlier work. He suggested that his discussions on planetary motion had inspired me, a suggestion I vehemently rejected. Hooke had a tendency to make broad, sweeping claims without the rigorous mathematical backing I demanded. While I could not deny his ingenuity in certain areas, I felt his self-promotion often overshadowed his actual contributions. Then there was Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a man whose name will forever be linked with mine because of our clash over calculus. Both of us developed the fundamental principles of calculus independently, but the question of who arrived at these ideas first became a matter of intense and public debate. The seeds of this conflict were sown in the 1670s and 1680s when Leibniz began publishing his work on calculus. By this time, I had already worked out the basic principles of calculus, though I had not published my findings. When Leibniz's papers reached England, some of my supporters, particularly within the Royal Society, accused him of plagiarizing my unpublished work. Leibniz, of course, denied this and pointed to his own independent development of the method. The dispute escalated in the early 18th century. By then, I was president of the Royal Society, and the organization issued a report on the controversy, effectively accusing Leibniz of copying my ideas. It should be noted, however, that the report was written by my allies and not an impartial investigation. Leibniz was understandably outraged, and our correspondence deteriorated into accusations and counter-accusations. Looking back, I can acknowledge that both Leibniz and I developed calculus independently. His notation, in fact, proved more practical than my own and became the standard used in mathematics today. Yet, during my lifetime, I could not concede this. The rivalry had become too personal, and I was determined to defend my reputation at all costs. These conflicts, first with Hooke and later with Leibniz, took a toll, not just on me but on the broader scientific community. They fostered divisions, particularly between English and continental scientists, that lasted well beyond my lifetime. For all my contributions to science, I know my conduct in these disputes has been criticized. Some see me as overly defensive, even vindictive. There may be truth in that. I was fiercely protective of my ideas, and I struggled to separate legitimate critique from what I perceived as attacks on my character. I cannot change the past, nor can I undo the animosities that arose. What I can do is reflect on them honestly. Science is meant to be a collaborative pursuit, a collective effort to uncover the truths of our universe. Yet, as my own experiences show, it is also an arena for human frailties, ego, pride, and rivalry. I do not offer these words as an excuse but as an explanation. My conflicts with Hooke and Leibniz were not merely intellectual disagreements, they were battles over recognition and legacy. In defending my work, I defended my very identity as a scientist. Whether I was right or wrong in my actions, history will judge. For my part, I can only hope that my contributions to knowledge endure, even if my flaws as a man are remembered alongside them. Section 3. I never forgave my mother. My relationship with my mother, Hannah Asko, was complicated, distant, strained, and filled with unresolved pain. It is not a part of my life I speak of easily, yet it shaped much of who I became. I was born into loss. My father, also named Isaac, died before I was born. My mother, left a young widow, was my only parent, and for the first few years of my life, we were inseparable. But then came a change that I struggled to understand as a child. When I was just 3 years old, my mother remarried. Her new husband, Barnabas Smith, was a minister, and she left me behind to live with him in a different town. I stayed on our family's small farm, placed under the care of my maternal grandmother. That abandonment, as I saw it, left a deep wound. A boy of such tender years cannot fully grasp the complexities of adult decisions. I only knew that my mother had chosen another life, another family, over me. For years, I carried the weight of that feeling, a sense of being unwanted or less important. Even as I grew older, my feelings toward her remained conflicted. When her marriage to Smith ended with his death, she returned to the family home, bringing with her the 3 children from her second marriage, my half-siblings. By then, I was an adolescent, and our relationship was distant, even strained. While I never disrespected her openly, I often found it difficult to engage with her. She was a woman of strong will and practical concerns, while I was absorbed in studies and the workings of my own mind. My education at Cambridge marked another turning point. It distanced us further, both physically and emotionally. By the time I began making my own way in the world, our lives were on separate trajectories. I immersed myself in mathematics, natural philosophy, and theology, while she tended to the practicalities of family and land. As an adult, I returned to Woolsthorpe Manor, where she still lived. Yet even then, our relationship lacked warmth or reconciliation. I struggled to understand her choices, while she likely struggled to understand mine. I never married, never established a family of my own, perhaps partly because I feared the complications of such bonds. My work consumed me, offering a refuge from emotions I found difficult to navigate. When my mother fell ill later in her life, I did not step into the role of a dutiful son as perhaps I should have. Our estrangement was not openly hostile, but it was palpable. I did not reconcile with her before her death, and this failure to mend our relationship has lingered in my thoughts ever since. Reflecting on it now, I recognize that the estrangement between us was a tragedy of missed opportunities and unspoken words. Perhaps if I had been more understanding of her circumstances, or if she had been more attuned to my feelings as a child, things could have been different. But life is rarely so accommodating. I often wonder how my early experiences with her shaped my own personality. My tendency towards solitude, my obsessive dedication to work, my mistrust of others, did these traits take root in the soil of those early years, when I felt abandoned and alone? It is difficult to say with certainty, but I cannot ignore the connection. For all my achievements in science and mathematics, my personal life was far from exemplary. My relationship with my mother is a painful reminder that human connections, even those most fundamental, require effort and understanding, qualities I often neglected in favor of intellectual pursuits. I do not excuse myself for this, but I acknowledge it as part of who I was. To those who view my life through the lens of my work, I would remind them that even the brightest minds carry shadows. My estrangement from my mother was one of mine, and though I cannot change the past, I hope that others might learn from it, that they might see the value of tending to relationships with the same care as one tends to the pursuit of knowledge. Section 4. They say I have bipolar disorder. Maybe, but I don't have time for that. I was always driven by a singular focus, an intense compulsion to understand the world and the laws that govern it. From a young age, I sought knowledge with an obsessive determination. I was not content with simple answers, I needed to delve deeper, to understand the mechanisms behind everything. This pursuit of knowledge defined my life, and yet, it came at a heavy cost. I worked tirelessly, often without rest, immersed in my studies and experiments for days on end. Sleep was a luxury I could not afford, and food was merely fuel for my mind, not something to be savored. I became known for this, for my inability to break away from my work. Time would slip by unnoticed, days, weeks, sometimes even longer. It was not uncommon for me to neglect my health in favor of my intellectual pursuits. This obsession, this relentless drive, shaped much of who I was. I would become consumed by a problem, often losing track of time, of the world around me. I was like a machine, working without ceasing, often to the detriment of my own well-being. I would forget to eat, or when I did, I would eat irregularly. I would forget to sleep, convinced that I needed to push through the exhaustion in order to make progress. The need for perfection, for the absolute clarity of thought, was so strong that it overwhelmed all else. But there were consequences to this obsessive behavior. My health, both physical and mental, deteriorated as I neglected it. There were times when I would become so consumed by my thoughts that I would sink into a deep depression. The weight of my work, of the knowledge I sought, became too much to bear at times. I would retreat inward, isolating myself from others. My mood would swing erratically, sometimes I would feel an intense sense of accomplishment and clarity, and at other times, I would feel hopeless, lost in a sea of confusion. It was as though I was trapped in my own mind, unable to escape the constant barrage of thoughts and ideas that raced through my head. These periods of emotional instability were not occasional, they were regular. At times, they felt almost like a cyclical pattern, where I would experience intense bursts of creativity and intellectual productivity, followed by sharp, debilitating crashes into depression. It was as though my mind could not maintain the momentum it needed to continue at the level of intensity one demanded of it. Some have suggested that I may have suffered from bipolar disorder, given the extreme fluctuations in my mood and energy levels. Others have posited that I may have struggled with anxiety, overwhelmed by the vastness of my thoughts and the weight of the responsibility I placed on myself. Regardless of the label, I can say with certainty that these mental health struggles were not just fleeting moments of discomfort, they were integral to my experience of life. In addition to my emotional difficulties, there were periods where I experienced intense periods of isolation. I did not form close relationships with others, preferring the company of my work. My tendency to push people away in favor of intellectual pursuits only exacerbated my sense of loneliness. Even when I did engage with others, I found myself unable to connect in meaningful ways. I could not understand why others did not share my passion, my drive for knowledge. My obsession with my work left little room for anything else, and as a result, I isolated myself more and more. The stress and pressure I placed on myself took a toll on my physical body as well. My health deteriorated in ways I could not ignore, but I would often disregard these warning signs. I felt invincible when I was consumed by my work, as though the pursuit of knowledge and discovery was the only thing that mattered. But when the physical exhaustion became too much to ignore, when the anxiety and depression became overwhelming, I would retreat even further into myself. Looking back, I see how this obsessive nature shaped my life, both for better and for worse. My work, my discoveries, the laws of nature that I uncovered, would not have been possible without this obsessive focus. But at what cost? My mental health suffered, my personal happiness was compromised, and I was left alone, struggling to understand the world around me and the mind within me. The very thing that drove me to achieve greatness also isolated me from the world and from the people who might have helped me find balance. I have often wondered if it was possible to achieve the level of success I did without sacrificing so much of my own well-being. Was it necessary to isolate myself from the world in order to make the breakthroughs I did? Or could I have maintained my health, my relationships, and my work in harmony? It is a question I cannot answer, but it is one that haunts me nonetheless. As I reflect on my life, I cannot help but feel a sense of regret over the toll that my obsession took on me. While I would not trade my discoveries, I would have preferred to have experienced more of the world, to have lived a more balanced life. Perhaps my struggles with mental health were not inevitable, but rather a result of my own choices driven by an overwhelming desire for perfection and a relentless need to understand the world at any cost. In the end, I suppose that this is the paradox of my life. The very drive that led me to greatness was the same force that led to my personal downfall. Perhaps my story is a cautionary tale, a reminder that balance is as important as brilliance, that the pursuit of knowledge should not come at the expense of one's well-being, and that in seeking to understand the universe, we must also remember to care for ourselves.